Before we jump into our last plenary, I do just want to make a few quick announcements. One is on Friday, we do have a post-conference workshop, and that is around the ASAM. And so if you weren't aware of that, we do have information in the guide. If you do want to attend, you need to register out at the registration desk. And it would be awesome if you could do that today, because we need to do a head count for lunch. But if for some reason you wake up Friday morning and you're like, I really want to go, you still can attend. So feel free to do that. And then I have been remiss in my conference host duties, and I really wanted, before she runs out of the room, to thank Kara. Where are you, Kara? So if you haven't met Kara, she's literally running around from about 6 a.m. to about 10 p.m. And so Kara is from Sac State and helps really make all the magic happen, and her team is phenomenal. So thank you so much. And then also our own DHCS staff and team, Michelle Wong and Crystal Sanchez have been, yay, I don't even know where they are. They're also floating around, but have done some phenomenal work. And then let's see here. Of course, don't forget to do your badges if you haven't already. We have folks there in the back. So with no further announcements, I have the real joy in introducing our next speaker. I've been working with Dr. Kelly Pfeiffer over the last few years, but especially within the last 2 years. And we asked her to speak today because I truly don't know anybody else that is more passionate, more focused, and more driven in eradicating this epidemic with opioids here in California. So Kelly is going to do a presentation for us, but I wanted to let you know that Kelly has not only been working with DHCS, but with multiple state departments, multiple entities across California. And she was recently awarded by the Department of Public Health for her work in addressing the opioid epidemic, which was well-deserved. And then prior to her work with the California Healthcare Foundation, she served as the Chief Medical Officer for San Francisco Health Plan. She has extensive experience, and you're really going to enjoy your time here with Kelly. Thank you.
It's such an honor to be with you all here. And as I was preparing, I was thinking about my medical school days, and I was remembering the first time I ever saw brain surgery, and I was so excited to be able to watch the skull open up and see real brain tissue. And the irony is I don't remember anything about the surgery except what the surgeon did right before we started, and he looked at me and he said, hey, you medical student, look at that MRI. Can you just confirm we're working on the left side of the brain? And I was polite, but I remember thinking, I would have thought you would have worked that out before you had a knife in your hand. And anybody who's ever been to a surgery center has probably had the experience of a surgeon taking out and writing initials on your right knee and just saying, just want to check now, we're going to do the right knee, and feeling that uneasy feeling that you would have thought that would have been quite clear. But what this all is a massive nationwide movement to create never events. You should never operate on the wrong side of the body. It takes actually a lot of systematic, multi-stakeholder work to make sure this happens. And I want to live in a California when opioid overdoses are a never event. And I don't have a clicker, do I? Ah, here. So I don't have any financial interest to disclose, but I actually have two disclosures. One is that I am culpable. I'm a primary care doc, and I was part of that generation of family doctors who thought we were helping people by putting people on opioid doses when they had pain at doses previously only seen in hospice. And we were absolutely convinced that there was overwhelming evidence that if you used opioids responsibly for pain, that there was less than 1% chance of addiction. And I imagine many of you in the room just must think that's ludicrous. Like, what kind of idiot would think that you can give someone a pill that acts on the brain like heroin and that no one would get addicted to it? But you have to wind yourself back to that time when this statistic was infiltrated into medical boards. It was endorsed by Joint Commission. It was in the American Pain Society and the Academy of Pain Medicine, and we were told we were opioid-phobic if we didn't believe it. And it became just the standard truth. And if you actually try and find out where that statistic came from, it's a little shocking because it's from 1980, and you can't find it online. You have to go to microfiche. I don't know, any of you done microfiche? I'm kind of revealing my age. But it's a one-paragraph letter to the editor, to the New England Journal, which says, "Dear editor, we put over 10,000 people in the hospital on IV morphine for whatever reason, and only 4 of them were so obnoxious that the nurses wrote down they were drug seeking. Therefore, headline, less than 1% of people using opioids for pain get addicted." And that stat was passed on to outpatient high-dose treatment, and you can see what happened. So I often talk about my own experience with my patients, and like many doctors, I got a call from a coroner from a young woman who had OxyContin with my name on that bottle, and that was a real wake-up call. But what keeps me going now is I also had people like Beth, name disguised, who transformed their lives. And this is like a secret I wish every primary care doctor knew, that if you start prescribing buprenorphine and start working in recovery, it is the best anti-burnout medicine there is. Because to take patients who are the people you can't stand to see in your schedule and watch them transform their lives and watch them walk the path of recovery and see the human inside them, it's an amazing experience. The second disclosure is that I'm a huge Prince fan, and I just have to say, I'd love to do a little thought experiment here. Like, let's say Prince was in an airplane and he had a heart attack. So it's emergency landing, and he goes to the hospital, and his life is saved, and he immediately gets on medications that are to prevent him from having another heart attack. He'll see a specialist. He might have his health plan involved. The hospital gets measured on whether he's put on the right medications. If he runs out in the waiting room, I'm out to the parking lot against medical advice, a nurse chases him down and say, "Don't you know you could die? You have to stay here." But what happens with people who have their lives saved due to an opioid overdose? They get naloxone, which is great. It puts them into the worst withdrawal feeling in your life. I don't know how many of you have seen people go into acute withdrawal. People feel like they're going to die. Everything hurts. Cravings are overwhelming. All they can think about is, I have to find that substance so I can feel okay because I'm so not okay. But what happens if they run out AMA? The staff kind of says, "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." There's no health plan there to try and make sure that they get the right treatment. Hospitals aren't measured on how many people get the right treatment. And that's the future California we need to get to, where there's no wrong doors and where opioid overdoses are never an event. So it's kind of curious to me why it's so difficult to get there. And I don't know if any of you read Atul Gawande. He's an incredible New Yorker writer, and he was puzzled by that. Why is it some medical interventions spread like wildfire and some take forever to change? And it's really one key idea. And he got to that key idea by looking at 2 breakthroughs that happened in surgery in the 1940s. Actually, no, I'm sorry, the 1840s. One was a major lifesaver, and that was hand washing and surgery, creating sterile conditions. And the other was anesthesia. And of course you would think, wouldn't the life-saving one be the one that would spread like wildfire? But if that's not true, you know that it took a generation, decades, for it to be now the expected case that every time you go to surgery, it's sterile. But, and why is it the ether was spread within 9 months? And he gets to, I think, the most important point which applies here, which is the ether solves a problem for the doctor and the patient immediately. It turns out it's quite difficult to do surgery on a live patient that you're having to hold down. It's not so pleasant for the patient either. And it turns out it's really difficult to convince people to do a lot of work, painful work, so at the time it was carbolic acid you had to wash your hands with, for something that was invisible and that would affect the patients weeks later. I mean, any of you who've ever tried to diet know how hard it is to do a lot of work now for supposed payoff later. And I think that's a good way of understanding what happened with this opioid epidemic, because prescribing opioids is a lot like ether. It solves a problem for me, the doctor, and the patient immediately. The patient's nerve cells get flooded with dopamine. they feel better. It actually helps their suffering, even if their suffering is because of a bad husband or unemployment or poverty, not just low back pain. I'm a hero. But of course, what happens downstream takes a lot of time to manifest. So what happens to all those dopamine receptors? They get shut down. Your body becomes less and less responsive to dopamine. You get a dopamine deficiency syndrome. And this is true whether you're taking them for pain or addiction, that it creates these behaviors that are labeled drug-seeking when it's really a symptom of the disease of addiction. And we turn into cops and we have this antagonistic relationship. So reversing it, I think it's helpful when we think about how hard this is to turn around, to think of it a lot like creating sterile conditions in surgery. It's going to take a multi-system effort, an all-hands-on-deck effort to do things differently, and it's hard work up front. Patients, the public, we need to get used to the idea that pills don't solve our problems and that we have to do hard work, which may mean exercise instead of, Vicodin and a couch. Clinicians need to do the hard work of actually having long conversations to patients about how to do acute pain differently, how to do chronic pain differently. We've put a whole generation of people with chronic pain on high-dose opioids, and now we have to do the hard work of saying, I know I put you on them, let's work hard to taper you to a safer dose or you're in trouble. And honestly, I think the hardest thing is for primary care docs, emergency room docs, specialists to have to step up and admit that there are never enough specialty addiction providers to take care of the epidemic, and all of us need to do our part. And it's hard. We weren't trained in addiction. We don't understand it, but all of us need to step up to make a difference. And this is the payoff. This was the most inspiring slide I've ever seen. Andrew Kolodny presented it once, and it's the AIDS epidemic. So look what happens. Death rates rise, 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 and suddenly plummet. So why is that? It was two things. One, finally we stopped blaming people for their condition, because AIDS, like addiction, is a condition that people were blamed for. They were barred from treatment. They were considered to deserve the disease they got. And when Ryan White became the poster child of, oh, wow, this person's like me, and when we finally had effective medication that was easily available, AIDS turned from a fatal condition to a chronic disease, and the death rates plummeted, and that's where we need to head. So I was asked to talk a little bit about what's going on in California, and I thought I'd put it in this framework of what you need to do, how to make change when change is hard. And I'm going to go through each of these points of a clear vision and a goal, pulling many levers at once, building partners in a very different way than we've done before, and using data to mark progress. So clear vision and goal, as I say, I think we need to be a place where overdose is a never event. Everyone is preventable. All of us who know somebody who've lost their lives to an overdose, think about all of those places that we could have intervened earlier and what could have been different. And France was facing the same thing. You see that gray boxes going up. They said, listen, we're losing people, and sure, it would be nice if every person had 3 days of addiction training and we had regulations to prevent diversion. I don't care. People are dying. Let's get buprenorphine everywhere. So they did insurance reforms and payment reforms, and they stripped away any barrier to buprenorphine access, and their death rate plummeted by 80%. Where here, we just got our 2016 data. We haven't budged. This, I think, is the scariest graph I have seen, and I recommend you go to Stat News and take it with you and think about these 9 scenarios, because the highest scenario is our current trajectory. If we don't change anything we do, another 500,000 people dead in the next decade in the US. And they looked at what are all the things it would take to bend that death curve and get us to dropping death rates. And it is all out on lowering opioid prescribing, getting addiction treatment everywhere on demand with effective evidence-based medications and behavioral health, harm reduction, naloxone, supervised injection sites. It's going to take a lot to get there. And that's why we have to pull every lever we have. And this is, again, like sterile techniques in surgery. This didn't happen overnight. It took policymakers and health plans and providers and consumer advocacy and technology and measurement, all these things pulling together. And there's a lot of exciting things going on in California in this realm. In fact, I was just on the phone 15 minutes ago at the California Statewide Opioid Safety Work Group. They have the DMV, medical board, managed care, health services, justice. Everyone is in that room every 2 months coordinating everything we're doing around the opioid epidemic. and it's really inspiring. The other thing that really inspires me is these coalitions. What is a coalition? What this is a public health department or an addiction treatment center or nonprofit or a medical society that gathers people in the community and said, let's look at our own data, let's understand what our overdose rates are, what our prescription rates are, what are the problems. Let's come up with a concrete, smart action plan to make measurable results in a year, and let's all pull in the same direction. A couple years ago, if you were asking about who's doing local work about coalitions, you would have said San Diego, Marin. Now there's over 35 counties of our 58 counties who are all of them have local opioid safety coalitions, all working on prescribing MAT and naloxone. And this represents 95% of our California population. And just a few small examples of what they're working on. This is a map of LA. And one of the things is let's get clinicians all practicing in the same way. So you don't want to go to one ER and get 30 Vicodin every time you have pain and go to another ER and be told no. And so they got prescribing guidelines in every ED department. But it was a little funny. They first got 74 out of 75 emergency departments on board, because the 75th one was, we're doctors, we don't like anyone telling us what to do. But of course word got out, and then they started hearing stories of, well, I went to hospital Y and they said no, but hospital Z doesn't have any prescribing guidelines, and pretty soon the hospital said, fine, we'll sign up. This is, I think, the hardest lift, but I've been really impressed by the coalition's effort, especially in these rural areas, to work on getting medication-assisted treatment. And even though it's tiny numbers, Plumas County had 0 overdose deaths last year, and they've been working really hard on figuring out how do you get addiction treatment in a county where there's very few people and very few resources. So they've gotten creative. They've gotten hospitals who have buprenorphine in the emergency department, and we've got a big project going there so that when you come in withdrawal, like Prince, you don't get a piece of paper and be told, good luck. You get buprenorphine, your brain gets stabilized, you can think, and then you actually get a facilitated referral to outpatient treatment. And there's some great stories, like one came out of Highland where a kid had got to be on heroin the typical way. It starts with Vicodin for an injury and then OxyContin. And then by the time he came into the ER with diarrhea, he was in severe withdrawal and then got treatment, and now he's back connected with his family and his church. I will say one thing, though. It's curious to me. You remember the Willie Sutton line, like, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. The one place where you have the majority of people with substance use disorder are jails. Jails and residential treatment center have the highest concentration of people with substance use disorder, and those are the two places that specifically exclude the opportunity to be on buprenorphine or methadone, which we now know are the most effective treatments for opioid use disorder. Naltrexone has its place, it's good for a small population, but it's nowhere near the success rates that we've seen with buprenorphine and methadone, and yet our jails are still not routinely offering it. But again, local coalitions have come together and they're changing that, and there's communities across California that are starting to be able to figure out how do you offer MAT to inmates. And so coalitions are also working hard on naloxone. There's a great story in Humboldt County of a librarian who saved a life because people who are homeless go to the library. There's someone who overdosed and she saved a life, and we're getting naloxone in the hands of first responders, and pharmacists are starting to dispense without a prescription. So the third piece about partnerships, I just want to say it really has to do with doing things differently. And one of the great stories that I love in Atul Gawande's article that I mentioned earlier was birth attendants. So these remote areas, they're giving birth in areas with no heat and not a lot of resources, and a lot of children were dying in the first month of life of pneumonia. So public health people went out and said, well, I want you to keep the infants skin to skin, because if they stay warm, they don't get sick later. And they would go out and nothing would change, and they'd go out and nothing would change. And finally it took about a year, and the birth attendants started putting the kids skin to skin, and someone asked one of them, like, why did you listen to these public health types? And she said, well, I didn't listen to them at first, but she kept coming, and she smiled a lot, and she was really nice, and ultimately I felt like she was a friend trying to help me and not someone trying to judge me. And I think that is the key answer. Because over and over in this work, we're so used to operating our own silos, it's just easy to say, the other person is doing it wrong. I've seen community health centers be very critical of opioid treatment programs be very critical about community health centers. And all of us have to stop thinking that telling the other group what to do will work. If you're in a large hospital system, you know trying to tell doctors what to do doesn't work. But if you bring us around the table and say, let's solve this together, and I need your help and I need your advice, it's a dramatically different response. And I was just reflecting when I was a medical director at clinic, I used to think the state was like this big faceless bureaucracy and nothing happened. And then you meet people like Marlise Perez who said, you're right, that doesn't make sense. Let me see if we can fix it. I mean, the state is full of really clever people who are actively trying to fix things, but they can't know about it unless we work closely with them. And I've mentioned a couple of these partnerships, the statewide opioid safety work group. Smart Care California is a group of big public purchasers all working together to work with health plans and providers to try and lower opioid overdose deaths. We've got the drug Medi-Cal system, the hub and spoke system, and all of these are all aligned towards the same goal. And the last thing I'll say is about data. It's really important in this epidemic to stay alert. And the opioid safety dashboard, it's a phenomenal place. Like you can go on now and see 2016 data at the county level, at the zip code level. You can see what the prescribing rates for buprenorphine are, high dose prescribing, death rates, ED rates. And this was just loaded on Friday. You see that big spike. Who can tell me what's explaining that big spike in opioid deaths? What's the one thing that's changing the epidemic in the state? Fentanyl. Yeah, that's our fentanyl deaths, up 48%. So year to year, we had about the same number of deaths, but of course we're seeing fewer prescription deaths and more fentanyl deaths, and that has to change our strategy. Again, all out on getting addiction treatment and harm reduction into our communities. So in summary, this is a lot of work. Like sterile technique in the OR, we have to go all out and work in many different levers and do that together. We have to prevent a new generation of people from being started on opioids that will harm them. We have to identify people with chronic pain and figure out if they're on a dose that's going to kill them, how do we work with them slowly to get to a safer dose and engage that person instead of just cutting them off and saying, good luck. We have to go all out on medication-assisted treatment and naloxone. So until we get to the place where there's less of a supply of fentanyl, where there's more opportunities for treatment, we stop those deaths in the meantime. So again, I have to tell you, I was so inspired to be here today, to be in a room with hundreds of people who all are aligned towards making opioid overdoses a never event. So let's get California to a zero overdose state. Thank you.
Awesome. Kelly left her badge here for me. Woohoo! I'm Kelly Pfeiffer! Okay, no. All right. Wow, I had 30 seconds of that. It really was amazing, though. Okay, so I do want to remind all of you there's still some cards on your table, and so, or if you can't find a card, any scratch paper will do, but if you have a question for Kelly, please write that down, and we'll have some Q&A at the end. But now I have the pleasure of introducing Sam Quinones. I hope I said that right. And I'm really, really fortunate. I, with Sudis, have read Dreamland. And yes, thank you. And those of us in the room that have read Dreamland, I have told so many people, you have to read it, you have to read it, you have to read it. Not only is it really, really informative about how we got to where we are today, but it's so well written. It's a really, really excellently written. So Sam is a former reporter with the LA Times, and of course he wrote this amazing book that has won some amazing awards. And so you're in for a real treat right now, so please welcome to the stage, Sam.
Thank you so much, really appreciate it. All right. So, how you guys doing? Everybody good? Welcome to Pomona. One of the great American towns. I grew up about 5 miles from here. My mom taught in the Pomona Unified School District for many years. And so I love getting back here. It's really cool. I can't really bear watching myself speak. So I'm going to go look this way a lot. Anyway, yes, it's great. It's great to be here, and it's you guys are really kind of the front lines. I'm a little amazed that this is the case, that I'm speaking here, because when I was working on the book, Dreamland, I thought, in fact, I told my wife, we're gonna have like 3 months, and this book's just gonna die after it comes out, because at the time, this wasn't all that long ago, nobody wanted to talk. I couldn't find parents who wanted to talk about it. Parents fabricated obituaries and all this, and it was a very difficult thing to get people interested in. A lot like there, as Kelly said earlier, in the AIDS epidemic, and now this is kind of just it's exploded in a way that I think is very, very healthy, both for the people who the families, and as well as for I think the country. Thanks very much, man. So anyway, I wanted to tell you my story about how I think this happened, dovetails a little bit with what you just heard, and a little bit about my own background. I'm 58, I grew up in the 1970s watching those great heroin movies. That's what I knew about heroin, was The French Connection, Prince of the City, Serpico, all those movies. That's what I thought it was white powder, it came from the East. Far East, came from Burma, Turkey, whatever, that kind of thing. I became a reporter, and one of the first great job that I had was covering crime in Stockton, California, which, if you know Stockton, which is a town I dearly, dearly love, it's a good place to be a crime reporter. At the time, it was really the crack epidemic. This was 89, 90, 91, right in there. I did, however, learn a little bit about the heroin, and that was to say that I saw that we had only in this state really black tar heroin, which is you may have seen, I suppose, some of you. Looks like Tootsie Roll. It's every bit that heroin, just like white powder is. It's just not as processed, and so it was everywhere in Stockton that I could find. I learned also that black tar heroin in this hemisphere is only made in Mexico. It's very cheap to make, and really was only found in those years, for many years, only found on the western side of the United States. Didn't cross the Mississippi River. I then spent 10 years living in Mexico. In Mexico, I didn't really cover the drug issue at all. I covered immigration. But one of the things I noticed that's relevant to the story I'm going to tell you is that all across Mexico, you go to these small little villages, and you would find villages where everybody in the town did the same job, you'd find villages where everyone was a construction worker. In my first book, I wrote a story about a town where everybody in the whole town made popsicles. If you know Mexico, you know Paleteria La Michoacana starts in one little town in Michoacan, state of Michoacan, and then they spread out, and this popsicle shop business model is everywhere. You go to the town, and you will see an enormous 2-story concrete popsicle at the entrance to the town, thanking the popsicle for all it did for this town of poor rancheros who attain the middle class selling popsicles. There's a town near Mexico City where everybody is a pimp. True story. I've been there a few times. They pimp girls to Queens, New York. And of course, the biggest example is immigrants. Once one guy in one town finds a job landscaping in Dallas, pretty soon the entire town is landscaping in Dallas. And the reason for that is because in a lot of small villages in Mexico, there is not access to education that would allow you to go from poor ranchero kid to mechanical engineer, say. So you just don't have access to that. So people learn their life's work from those around them, people around them. And once one guy finds a job, then everybody uses that same job, does that same job. I came back from Mexico in 2004. In 2000, and to work for the LA Times, in 2009, they put me on a team of reporters whose job it was to cover the Mexican drug war, which had kicked off. My job, because I was in LA, spoke Spanish, knew Mexico, was to cover how drugs were trafficked once they crossed the border, how they were trafficked to the rest of the United States, right? And it was in that capacity when, as a reporter, one day in 2009, I was tooling around the internet looking for a story that I might write when I came upon a series of stories, 6 or 8 stories, from the small town of Huntington, West Virginia, on the Ohio River in West Virginia, stating that in that period of time, this was in the fall of 2007, these stories were written, 6-month period, a dozen people had died of overdoses to black tar heroin in Huntington, West Virginia. Immediately, that stunned me. I was like, first of all, what's black tar heroin doing east of the Mississippi River? What's it doing in West Virginia, right? I looked up, West Virginia's got the lowest percentage of foreign-born people in the entire country. A lot of people just don't go to West Virginia. People are leaving West Virginia. It's a great state, it's a beautiful state, but people don't go there. Also, why would there be any appetite for heroin at all? I mean, West Virginia did not show up in those great heroin movies that we used to watch back in the 1970s. So why West Virginia? Well, I called Huntington PD. They told me, yeah, we remember those days 2 years ago. It was frightening. We had one heroin overdose in 10 years, and all of a sudden it was a dozen in 6 months, and we'd have lost more if the paramedics hadn't been so fast. But all of that dope didn't come from here. All of that dope came from Columbus, which is just about a 2-hour ride up a county road from Huntington. All our addicts were going up there, buying their dope, bringing it back here, and it was too much. So you got to call. I called DEA in Columbus, and bless his heart, I'm able to talk with a wonderful DEA guy who's been 25 years on the job, and I mention heroin, and he gets really, really mad. He says, you know what? I've been in this job a long time. I came here 10 years ago. We had no heroin in the entire town of Columbus or the metro region. Then we begin to see this weird thing. We begin to see Mexican guys driving around old beat-up cars, their mouths, once we busted them, we realized their mouths filled with tiny balloons filled with 1/10 of a gram doses of black tar heroin. They just reeled down, and they sold it very much like pizza delivery. It was a delivery system for so they had at first we thought they were individual dealers, one guy working alone. Come to bust them, and we realized, no, it's actually part of a crew. There's an operator standing by to take addict orders. The addict calls the number. The operator dispatches usually one of 3 or 4 drivers he has driving around town. They meet. There's an international drug deal essentially is consummated right there, and they each go their separate ways. This guy told me this is the strangest thing I've ever seen. I've never in 25 years never seen anything like it in drug trafficking in America, because first of all, they don't use guns. And my experience with drug trafficking and the underworld in general was they always use. That's how you get market share. Was you kill your competition. Al Capone did it. The Colombians did it with cocaine, Bloods and Crips. But these guys never do. Then he said, we thought they were again part of some small little group. Turns out there's numerous of these cells. We bust them. We'll bust a cell. They'll reconstitute within a few days. They always are sending more people up. They've got a big jug of water in the car with them in case the cops pull them over. They swig it down, and all the balloons they got in their mouth are swallowed. He says, I've never seen, they pay their drivers a salary. Who gets paid a salary in the drug world? Nobody. Everybody's fronting dope. Then he told me something that really just changed my life. He said, and the craziest thing is, and I thought I'd heard a lot of crazy things in the 20 minutes we were talking. He said, the craziest thing is, they're all from the same town. And see, I was like so ready to hear that. As a reporter, I've written 2 books about Mexico. I knew these villages. I knew right then when he told me, yeah, there's a town that traffics heroin, sells it like pizza in Columbus, Ohio. There's one town somewhere. He told me the name of the town. He gets on the phone with his case agent. He comes back on. He says, the name of the town is Tepic. Right then I knew he was wrong. He wasn't giving me he wasn't lying, he just gave me some bad information. Tepic is a capital city of a state called Nayarit, which is south of it's on the Pacific coast, about 12 hours south of Arizona, but it was a 350,000 population town. There's no way a system like this grew out of a town that size. Had to be a small village. So I asked him, you've arrested so many guys, can you give me a letter of, a list of all the people you've sent to prison? He did. I wrote to them all. I think I wrote to 15, 20 guys in Spanish. This is how you do it if you're a crime reporter. You got to reach out to these guys in prison. They're magnificent sources. I said, do you want to talk about your pizza delivery heroin system, whatever you guys do? Seriously, there's no other way to do it. And I wait for about a month. I was about ready to go on to my next story when one guy, out of all the guys I called, one dude called me back. And bless his heart, doing 15 years in a federal prison. He says, yes, we are all from the same town, and no, yes, we are all heroin traffickers, and no, that town is not Tepic. It's a little town called Jalisco. Well, if you know Mexico, you know there's an enormous state called Jalisco, which is where Guadalajara is located, right? Well, this is actually a small town not far from Tepic in the state of Nayarit called Jalisco, spelled with an X. He says, we are all heroin, everybody in that town who comes here is a heroin trafficker, pretty much. He told me how this system started. He said the system started in Van Nuys, Canoga Park, not far from here, over in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. Their families, this was back in the 80s now, he said, families from this one town, a lot of them did the legitimate jobs, but a few families figured out how to cook black tar heroin from the opium poppy that you may know or may not know grows very nicely in the Pacific Northwest mountains of Mexico. They bring it up. At first, they would sell it to the addicts who were in parks. They would just sit there stationary and cut off little pieces. And this worked for a while, but after a while, people in the town began to realize this was a magnificent business, and they began to saturate. Soon there's too many guys cutting off pieces of heroin in parks. The cops get wise. They can't kill each other because they're all from the same town. They know where each other's mothers live. So in time, after the arrests happen, they begin to go to cars. And soon the system, the rudimentary elements of the system that later developed into a very sophisticated thing, takes place in the late 1980s. Of course, back then it's cars, payphones, beepers. Later, of course, it's cell phones that revolutionized it all. And in time, they expand. They begin to do what any kind of capitalist franchise enterprise does when it faces declining profitability. It expands. One of the first places they came was right here to Pomona, Ontario. San Diego was another place. Eventually, they begin to expand Honolulu, Portland, Reno, various places like that. These guys expanded based on something we all know very, very well, which is cheap Mexican labor. They knew how to exploit it just the way any farmer or restaurant would. I always wondered, the guy in the DEA in Columbus told me, these guys are so easy to arrest because they're very public. You could follow them very quickly, arrest them, it's not a problem. The problem is eradicating them. They would send more and more guys with every bust. I began to wonder, why is that? Why would you back home know that all these guys are being arrested and still raise your hand to come north and drive heroin around some town you didn't know? And I got very deep into this story, went down to the town for 4 or 5 days, interviewing lots of guys in prison, and eventually came to the idea, one of the reasons was they figured out that this system of selling heroin like pizza was a magnificent system of transforming very, very cheap black tar heroin into stacks of gleaming Levi's 501 jeans. I had lived in Mexico in the mid-90s when the expansion was really gaining force, really gaining momentum. Back then, Levi's 501 jeans were the gold standard of rural Mexican menswear. They were very good looking. They were they looked wealthy. They looked quality. And if you had them, you were felt to have kind of arrived. Well, the guys running this system realized that they were dealing with addicts who were magnificent shoplifters. They could go in and clean out a Sears or a JCPenney's or a Target in no time. They begin to ask, the dealers begin to ask the addicts for orders. They begin to give them orders. They realize that they will steal pants for them. And soon these guys are stealing huge stacks of these pants, bringing them in, getting a hit of heroin for each pair of pants, and these dealers are taking them home and handing them out back home in Nayarit like Santa Claus. All their friends and all these boys back home who have these kind of cheap, really thin Mexican jeans, see this, see their friends walking around, see all the girls want to talk to these guys. See, they have money to be able to buy the beer for all their new friends that they have, and soon every kid in town and all the villages around is raising their hand. Hell yeah, I'll go north. I'll sell this. All farm boys, not cartel killers. This is not a story necessarily about Chapo Guzman. It's about a lot of kids trying to find a way up. They're polite. When I would interview them, they'd be very polite, traditional, conservative guys. They just wanted to make $5,000, $10,000, go home, buy some land, have enough money for a girl to marry them, and that's it. They were, however, very important to understand this, part of a much larger story in our heroin market. Before that, as those movies used to show, a very large chunk of our heroin market came from the Far East. Turkey principally, Burma, Thailand, those places. It got to our shores expensive and relatively weak. It had changed hands, it had been cut several times, and by the time it got here, it was really kind of just not the greatest quality. In the 1980s, all that changed. We had massive change in our heroin market in the 1980s because back then, you'll remember, the Colombian cartels were very ferocious, very efficient. The Mexican guys were becoming so. What ends up happening is simply their heroin simply outcompetes the heroin coming from the Far East. It gets here cheaper and far, far more potent. And by the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, virtually all of our heroin came from Mexico or Colombia, except for nobody noticed, except for maybe the DEA and a few others. Why? Because our heroin problem was not what it is today. We were not minting new opiate addicts every thousands of them every month. The cops, meanwhile, could not arrest enough of these guys from Jalisco, Nayarit, including many of the towns surrounding them. These guys they began to expand throughout the western United States through the early 1990s. But remember, this was a time, again, when we were not creating huge numbers of addicts due to a lot of what you just heard from Kelly. Every town had a static number. They had to compete with each other for these addicts, and so they became, because they could not kill each other, because they were all from the same town, they became instead master marketers, master at branding. Every balloon had a tenth of a gram dose of very potent black tar heroin. They gave them away free in front of methadone clinics. They devised little come-ons. You buy from me Monday through Saturday, I give you a free one on Sunday. Bring me 5 new clients, I give you 50 free balloons, because they could not kill each other, and they had a customer service number in case the dope was bad or the guy was on time or was rude. You could call and say, and sure enough, boom, they would show up giving you free dope. They give you free dope when you got out of jail. Make sure you continued to work with them. Stay with us. We're the ones you need to stick with. The story of the Jalisco boys, as I call them, is a fascinating one, but it would only have been a minor thing had it not been for the revolution in pain management that Kelly described a little bit ago. That transformation, revolution, I really think it was, overturned decades-old concepts of how we needed to treat pain. Some of those needed overturning. But of course, that pendulum, once it started swinging, got pushed very strong by pharmaceutical companies, pain specialists. They promised the idea that these pills were now virtually non-addictive. Science now knew they were virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. And I think the even more dangerous corollary to that idea, which is therefore it doesn't matter how many of these pills you prescribe, people will not get addicted. And so you began to see people taking home bottles of 60 Vicodin, 60 OxyContin after every minor surgery. The game changer in all this, there was a lot that went on, and I think a lot of you probably saw this yourselves, but the game changer in all this was OxyContin. OxyContin was a game changer for a few reasons, but one right here was that the way it was promoted. It was promoted first to doctors, not to just run-of-the-mill patients. It was promoted to doctors. And the way Purdue Pharma, the company that makes OxyContin, promoted was very much as if they were promoting an over-the-counter medicine. They gave away toys, they gave away fishing hats, pens, calendars. They gave away trips to Scottsdale and Miami and Arizona for continuing medical education seminars. There was a CD that they would give away called Swing in the Right Direction with OxyContin, which showed a couple waltzing through a garden or something like that, I guess, swinging to OxyContin, where the CD contained Count Basie tunes and a variety of other swing band tunes. And you know, just like the Jalisco Boys, in the end, all of this 10 years, 15 years of this promotion by Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies, after a while, marketing worked. 1990, the entire world supply of hydrocodone is 3 tons. 2010, the world supply of hydrocodone is 42 tons, and 99% of it is used right here in the United States. Along with that was this idea American patients took on, that we were now entitled to a life free of pain. A doctor was there to fix us. We were not there really to be accountable for our wellness because they had pills to fix us. And when the doctor told us that we needed to lose weight or stop smoking or a variety of other things, well, we didn't really want to listen to that. Excuse me. And in time, as I said, marketing worked. In time, these pills began sloshing around the country, an unprecedented, huge amount of opiate pain-killing pills all across the country because it's promoted not by drug traffickers but by doctors. One of the ground zero for all this, the place where the drug companies massively marketed first, was the area of Columbus to the north, Cincinnati to the west, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, part of Virginia, western Pennsylvania, southern Indiana. That whole area is kind of ground zero for what we are now seeing all across the country. And of course, a big part of that is Appalachia. One place that I spent a lot of time when I was working on the story is a town called Portsmouth, Ohio. Portsmouth is right on the Ohio River across from Kentucky, small little town. It's a long way away from here, but in a lot of ways, it's just right around the corner from almost every place in America. It had been an all-American town. It had a steel factory. It had shoe factories. It had a main street that just bustled with locally owned businesses. It had 50,000 population. And at the center of life, at the center of this town, was this enormous football field-sized swimming pool. It was this life-giving force. It's where everybody kind of grew up. It was the town, a babysitter. Parents dropped their kids off at the pool at 9 in the morning and picked them up at 5 in the afternoon. The owner of the pool, check this attitude out, also owned a shoe factory, didn't think he needed all the money from the pool, so he reinvested the money and bought more land, and soon there was more land. There was space for picnic tables and basketball courts, dances on Friday nights. And the name of this pool was Dreamland. There was always more room for everyone at Dreamland. Class differences kind of melted away at Dreamland, where everybody looked the same in swim trunks. The plant manager, the line worker. The cycle of life kind of repeated at Dreamland. When you were a toddler, you were there with your mom in the shallow end. By the time you were in high school, your mom was somewhere in the field with her friends, and you were jumping off the diving board in the deep end. You lost your virginity out in the fields that the guy kept buying to expand and your daughter started her life in the toddler end of dreamland. 1990, the steel mill leaves, shoe factories begin to leave as well. Soon, Main Street can't hang on. It's essentially empties out and is kind of eventually consumed by the Walmart that opens up on the outskirt of town. Half the population leaves, so now there's 25,000 people in town. Houses and buildings downtown stand abandoned. And in 1993, Dreamland can no longer sustain itself. They dig up this magnificent, glorious pool, about as big as this, about 3/4 the size of this room, and replace it with an enormous strip mall, of which O'Reilly's Auto Parts is now the anchor tenant. The people who remain in town turn indoors. They have no place to kind of commune, to see each other. In fact, Walmart takes the place of Dreamland as the only place where people actually, see each other, have human relations in a weird way. The real human connection that was established at the swimming pool is now replaced with this kind of very superficial, fleeting thing that is more akin to the kind of connection we have with people on social media today. The end of Dreamland, I think, spelled the end of community, a stripping away of the societal immune system, leaving this town very vulnerable, not unlike, I think, what happened to Indians when the Europeans arrived with smallpox. Portsmouth was right at the center of that big kind of ground zero area, and the reason I tell its story is because it became the birthplace of the pill mill. One doctor started, I talk about him in the book. He begins to train other doctors. They begin to move out on their own. And soon these little scandalous pain clinics in which people are lining up in their pajamas for sometimes for hundreds of yards to get their prescription start to replicate all over, first Portsmouth and then surrounding areas. Portsmouth at its height had a dozen pill mills, prescribing in a town of 20,000, 9 million pain pills a year. So bad did it get that in Portsmouth, there really developed a kind of an OxyContin economy. You could pay for anything you needed, for life itself almost, with pills. Pills were perfect currency. They didn't dissolve easily. They each of them had marked on their the denominations, 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams, whatever it was. After a while, they were backed by the central banks, which were these pill mills, continuing to put out huge numbers of prescriptions. After a while, you could buy cars, T-bone steaks, Xboxes, you could buy dental appointments, cable service, all paying for it with pills. Crucial again to this OxyContin economy was Walmart. I have a theory that in this area that I just described, this problem would not have spread nearly so fast had there been this kind of strong, locally owned economic ecosystem of locally owned businesses, each with an owner there at the door. Because then the addicts would not have had such an easy time of it. They would have to go door to door to door, stealing enough to make their habit every day. But Walmart had sucked up all of that stuff and regurgitated it onto its floor outside of town. One-stop shopping meant very easy one-stop stealing. And the folks in Portsmouth today could go on for long hours, which I heard frequently, about how they would use Walmart as the source for their entire daily habit. And the good thing about it was that if you got kicked out of that Walmart, there was another one in 20 miles in any direction you wanted to drive. As all that was going on, as this pain revolution that you heard about earlier took place, as the pill mills were exploding, and first in Portsmouth and then in surrounding areas in this whole kind of ground zero region. As all that was going on, those Jalisco boys that I told you about earlier made that jump over the Mississippi River and landed by pure coincidence in Columbus, Ohio. 1998, summer of 1998, I interviewed the guy extensively, the guy who did that. I write about the Jalisco Boys not because they're the only heroin traffickers from Mexico. They are not. I write about them because they are the first ones to figure out and then systematically exploit the coming enormous market for heroin that is implied by massive and widespread prescribing of opiate painkillers by doctors all across the country. They figured that out in Columbus. Once they got the idea, they began to follow the pills, and kind of the rest was history. They stumbled on it, and then just from there on, they just went to towns where the pills were big. Again, in all this, though, OxyContin was a game changer. All right? Up to that point, before OxyContin, people would mess around with low-dose Vicodin or Percocet or whatever, but these drugs had acetaminophen, they had Tylenol, and so by the time you developed a serious addiction, desperate enough that you would consider using heroin, you had done such massive damage to your internal organs. Most people really never did it, never got that far. There was no bridge between these and heroin until 1996 when OxyContin came out. OxyContin, because it had no abuse deterrent, took you to very high levels. 100 milligrams, 200, 300, 400 milligrams a day. And with that, you needed something cheap and just as potent. And all of a sudden, that change back in the 1980s in our heroin market that nobody else had noticed became piercingly relevant. We would not have a heroin problem or fentanyl problem today were it not for OxyContin, period. We would also not have the kind of heroin problem we have today without cheap Mexican heroin, cheap heroin coming in from Mexico. The first place you saw this change, people transitioning from pills to heroin and dying, the very first place I believe that happened was in Huntington, West Virginia in the fall of 2007. This epidemic, remember, is the first epidemic in modern post-World War II America in which a scourge, however, did not start with drug mafias. It starts with doctors believing something that wasn't always true in their attempts to help us control our pain. So quietly, addiction spread well beyond that ground zero area. It spread because, truth is, there was no violence associated with it. It was easy to believe nothing was wrong. Our crime rates are dropping as our overdose deaths are going up. Parents also were ashamed and embarrassed that their kids were addicted and hid that fact. They fabricated those obituaries I was talking about earlier. And it spread because so many families believed they were all alone. Appalachia was our canary in our coal mine, but we're used to ignoring Appalachia. Soon it spreads to wealthy suburbs of Columbus, Charlotte, Salt Lake City, Indianapolis, Nashville, and on and on. And strangely, I began to realize as I got far into this story, it was the children of the people who benefited most from our economic expansions of the last 20, 25, 30 years. It was those kids, those families, who were getting addicted to drugs used, of all things, to numb pain. You look at their lives and you say, what pain could you had perfect lives? And it's at that point when I realized that the story I was working on was not, I thought I was writing a great book about drug traffickers, shiny covered, and they're going to make a documentary on A&E or something like this, and I began to realize midway through, no, this is a story far deeper. It's about who we are as Americans, what we have become as a country. I believe it is deeply connected to the fact that we have spent 35 years in this country destroying community in America. We have mocked and clawed at the girdings of government that provide the public assets and the infrastructure that make communal life possible. We, meanwhile, have exalted the private sector. We beat communism out of the Cold War and thus came to believe the free market was some infallible God. And we accepted this economic dogma and allowed, even encouraged, jobs to go to go overseas. We lavishly rewarded our priests of finance, these guys who figured out new ways of pushing jobs abroad. We demanded perfection from government and forgave the private sector its every trespass. We began to admire wealthy business people, regardless of whether the way they made their money produced anything of value for this country or our communities. And at the same time, we laughed at government, ridiculed it as inefficient, wasteful, incompetent. We had a president who said government is the problem. That we can, as if we can all go it alone. We were already doing it, so weren't we? We talked about government as separate from ourselves, scornful of the idea that we should come together, that we could compromise and through that solve our problems together. Some of our think tanks posited the idea that government in fact posed the greatest threat to personal freedom. The answer, therefore, as we exalted the private sector, was to shrink government, to starve the beast, in one man's word. Yet here, this story right here, is a story of a drug nightmare created almost entirely by the private sector and by our own desire to avoid pain. It has unleashed the biggest threat to personal freedom in America today, in my opinion, which is opiate addiction. I found it interesting as I did this book that for the most part, the people who really, the only ones who wanted to talk about it were coroners, cops, public health nurses, drug counselors, ER docs, prosecutors, all of whom were drawing a government salary. In this story, all profits are private. The Sackler family, which owns Purdue Pharma, is now valued at $14 billion due to $35 billion of sales in OxyContin. All the costs have been borne by the public sector, jails, courts, ERs, on and on, police and health departments. But I also began to realize there was more to it even than that. This was also a time when Americans began to believe, I think, in silver bullets, that we didn't have to be accountable, certainly not for our own wellness. We believed in easy answers to complicated problems. The complicated problem was the mystery of human pain. The easy answer was pills for everybody in this case. We began to believe that old rules didn't apply to us. It was a kind of a fantasy world we lived in. We believed in a democracy, that we could all just go it alone, that we had been doing so. We believed, this was also a time when, you remember when we believed that it was normal that every year 2, 3, 4 baseball players would hit more than 60 home runs a year. And that was when it had not happened in the entire history of the sport more than twice. And we began to believe that opiates prescribed in mass supply would not addict large numbers of people. We've developed an obsessive fear of the public sphere. Parents were hovered over their kids, afraid they'll feel pain, afraid that they would fail. We became ferocious in our attempt to keep kids from feeling pain, from feeling consequences of their failure. We gave out trophies just for showing up. The Atlantic Monthly wrote a story that said that kids who grew up in an era of hyperprotection from physical pain were demanding to be protected as well from painful ideas. They were asking on college campuses for safe spaces and for trigger warnings in advance of ideas that might provoke a strong, disturbing emotional content. I thought that's why you went to college, was to be disturbed by ideas. I think as a country, moreover, we grew to believe that consumption and the accumulation of stuff was the path to happiness. We exalted the private sector, the free market. We built into our suburbs a deep and sad isolation, and we called that prosperity. Add to the mix was the expansion of technology that connects us to the world, but really leaves us knowing very little about the guy who lives across the street. We pretend that we're informed by 24-hour cable news. 24-hour cable news is just like heroin. What 24-hour cable news has done is separate us all into little bubbles. So we talk only to people we know and who think like us. The result of all this, I think, and much, much more, is that we wound up dangerously separate from each other, whether in poverty or in affluence. We wound up, in other words, just like Portsmouth after Dreamland closed. Kids no longer play in the street, parks are underused, Dreamland lies buried beneath a strip mall. Why then do we wonder that heroin is everywhere. Our very search for painlessness, for comfort, led us to it, I think. Heroin is the final expression of values we have fostered for 35 years, a final expression of our fetish for the private individual at the expense of the public. Heroin, I think, turns every addict into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary, hyper-consumer, a life that finds opiates, turns away from family, from community, and devotes itself entirely to self-gratification by buying and consuming one product, the drug that most makes being alone not just all right, but preferable. No, this story, it seems to me, is about much more than just simply drug trafficking and marketing. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. I believe, therefore, more strongly than ever that the antidote to heroin is not naloxone, it is community. You want to keep kids off heroin, make sure people in your neighborhood do things together, in public, often. Get outside, get them outside, create your own dreamland on your block. Make your kids ride their bikes outside, let them skin their knees. Don't protect them from the consequences of their failure. We got away from that, it seems to me, from what's best about our country. We rid ourselves, I think, of things so essential to us that they have no price, and we have been invaded by cheap junk. Heroin is what you get when you destroy dreamland. Today, to end up, the supply of opiates on our street is so vast, so scary, that getting into treatment can take months. Getting out is like Russian roulette. That's what happens as a culture when you start believing in easy answers and silver bullets to complicated problems. In Ohio, in parts of Ohio, there's 90% pure heroin on the street, a sign of how many people are selling. The Jalisco boys that I wrote about were the innovators, the pioneers who figured this out almost 20 years ago. Think about that. That's a mind-blowing idea. These guys were onto this idea 20 years ago. They'd figured this out. Now they became big fish in small ponds, and now those ponds are enormous oceans. Fentanyl, as we were talking about earlier, is now so scary you can buy it on pornographic sites on the dark web that are scary things to behold. Fentanyl has also democratized the dope trade. Now anybody can get it. Almost anybody seems like can make it. The good news is I think this is the good news, there is no solution. We tried the solitary solution, the sexy solution, and look where it got us as Americans. Pills is the only solution to our pain. I think we need to stop believing that there's an easy way out, that old rules don't apply, that we have no need for each other. This epidemic is calling on us to see how important community is. No, there is no solution. There are many solutions, each part of a mosaic, a community of solutions, if you like. Happily, none of them, not one of them, is sexy. None will do the trick alone. Each is small, grows from immersion in the problem and from communities working together. It seems to me that we ought to rediscover the great truth, which is that American self-reliance requires depending on each other, watching out for each other. We need to turn away from the idea that we do not have to compromise, that we don't need each other, that we can all get along on our own. To me, all that is just heroin talking. The best good news is that this problem is no longer private. It's no longer hidden, no longer just a thin line of public employees fighting this alone. Parents are stepping out and telling their stories. Cops and public health it's one example of how people are coming together. Professions that have very little in common culturally seem to be moving together. I urge them to continue to work together. Go out for a beer, get to know one another. It's through that kind of synergy that we find the solutions that we need. The antidote, again, to heroin is not Narcan, it is community. It is in leveraging all that talent and energy, that expertise and budget, breaking down those silos. I have faith in my country that on that path is where we will find the solutions. For you all working in recovery, supporting those who work in recovery, you are so important to all this. I want to ask you that though you become discouraged, to keep on, Though the numbers keep rising, like some disastrous high tide, just keep on. Don't become hardened. Do not lose energy. Your neighbors need you badly, whether they know it or not. Your churches and schools need you very badly. It will most likely not be noticed the way it should, the work that you do. Because in life, most real, solid change happens piecemeal. Piecemeal isn't sexy. But I hope you have no doubt of the importance of what you are doing. This country would be truly lost without you. I have faith that in time, as you keep at it, your neighbors will thank you. In time, your town will thank you. Your country will thank you. And for now, and in case you haven't heard it for a while, I'd like to thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. So, cards on the table. If you have any questions for Sam, I have a few up here
Thank you.
for Kelly. And before I forget, I do want to mention these are Sam has these available. He's going to, after the presentation, be in the back, and he said he also will sign them for you. But it is a phenomenal read. He just gave us a highlight of the story, but it really is, I think, really important to know how we have gotten here. So while I'm waiting for the questions for Sam, I'm just going to run through a few for Kelly. You're up. Awesome. So, Kelly, you mentioned the false statistic of 1% of prescription opioid users becoming addicted. Do you know the accurate statistics of addiction rates?
I don't know that.
I mean, I think it depends on the population, and I've seen anything from 6% to 40%
Right.
around there.
Yeah,
Great.
something like that. That 1% is not at all.
And I think the other thing to think about is that doesn't represent people harmed by long-term opioid use, because we've learned that even if you take the meds exactly as correct as prescribed, if you're on high dose, it affects your mood, it affects your weight, it affects your function, your sexual desire, your bone density, it's your entire endocrine system. It was just remarkable, all of the different impacts of long-term opioid use that we had no idea about. And the most profound, of course, is this essentially brain damage of totally destroying your dopamine system, which changes how you can think and act and motivate yourself.
Great, and this is kind of a follow-up question, too, for either of you. Do you know any sort of statistics about with adolescents with opioids that in needing care?
There was a fantastic panel earlier for those who were able to attend it, and my colleague Catherine Chair at the California Healthcare Foundation has published a report on substance use disorder in adolescents. And what I love about what she said is that substance use disorder is a pediatric condition, because we know the vast majority of people with substance use disorder start in adolescence. But I just said that to duck the question because I don't have the statistic in my head.
Thank you. One more for Kelly. Do you believe buprenorphine is addictive? And so how do we work so that this isn't just the next epidemic?
I think it's important to understand what the word addictive means. I mean, the substance use disorder, as you know, is defined as losing control over a drug, ignoring the negative consequences of taking that drug, and continuing its use despite those negative consequences. And yes, there are people who will abuse any drug you give. There's people abusing Neurontin. There's always going to be a subset who abuse any drug. But the different thing about buprenorphine is because it's only a partial agonist and it blocks some receptors and acts on other receptors, it's a very different drug than OxyContin. It doesn't produce the highs. It's very long acting. It creates a stabilization in the brain, unlike creating the cycle of craving, needing higher doses, craving, needing higher doses. So all I can say is I just go back to the data is that if you take people with opioid use disorder and you make them be drug-free, they'll be 6% who are sober in a year. If you give them buprenorphine or methadone, that is 60 to 70%. If you make those people detoxify and get off that, the death rate doubles in buprenorphine and it triples in methadone. So I actually think that question goes back to what Sam is saying, is that this is not going to be solved by a pill. The underlying thing that's creating this epidemic is our lack of community and the incredible despair that these communities are facing. So, honestly, our agenda at the California healthcare system, working in healthcare, is to stop the deaths until we can try and systematically change our society and turn around all of the social ills that are representing themselves into this heroin epidemic.
I fear that, can you hear me with this? No? Okay, let me move this here. Hold on. I fear that, now can you hear me? Okay, yeah. That we may be at times replicating what we've done with opiates with medically assisted treatment, which the key word in that is assisted. It's not the buprenorphine, Suboxone, whatever, methadone, is not the only part of the treatment. I was in a hospital a while back, a few months ago, and I was speaking in New Hampshire, and I was speaking with some nurses, and they dealt with a lot of kids, infants who were, of course, going through withdrawals shortly after birth, and they said, what an infant needs most of all, who's going through that? And I said, no, what's that? And they said, to be cuddled. To be cuddled. Don't we all? Right? We all need to be cuddled, right? But we need, and it seemed metaphorical to me in some sense, where that's what, first of all, we all need, but also people going through recovery need that more than just the drugs that they're giving the kids. They need to know that they're in it together with somebody else. They're not in it alone. They're not just out there, doing it on their own. This has been far too much the, excuse me, the theme of our society, if you ask me, in America for 3-4 decades now, it seems to me. And I think those kids in those neonatal wards have something that they can teach us, that yes, Suboxone, buprenorphine, whatever, methadone is very, very important, more important than ever because of what's out there on the street. You need to give people a fighting chance when they go out there on the street, because the level of toxic drugs available on the internet and wherever else is just scary. But it's not the only thing, and the problem is that it's too easy as a political answer to say, well, we're opening up lots of Suboxone clinics, because it's a way of saying, yes, we're doing something, when in reality it's a far more nuanced approach that needs to take place. I agree that what we need, that it seems to me that kind of community approach to that as well is essential.
Great, thank you. This question is for Sam. What are your thoughts about the President's Commission on the Opioid Epidemic?
Well, I thought some of the ideas in the draft they had were very good. One pops out was we need to really revamp our medical school curriculum with regard curricula across the country with regard to pain management and addiction recovery, treatment, all this kind of stuff. That was one thing I was looking for, because it's not a terribly sexy thing. It's easy to say, we're going to put a bunch of money into this, whatever. This was not a sexy thing, and that they noted that, I thought was really important. The problem was not so much, I didn't think, with what they proposed. It was then the President's the way he then just announced that this would be a national emergency. This was now considered a national emergency, which did not give me an impression that he had thought much about it, that as you should with a national emergency, nor in the speech that I heard anyway, did he have one single detail about what was next. He was going to do a lot and spend a lot of money. To me, that felt like we're going to throw pills at everybody with pain. To me, there was no. The commission had a lot of good ideas that I think other people have batted around and discussed for quite some time now, and some of them have become more politically palatable. Naloxone, needle exchange, this kind of thing. But It's the follow-up, and that commission doesn't matter if there's no follow-up in the Oval Office, and that was what concerned me more than that draft report that I read, which is great. Got a lot of good ideas. I'd read a lot of these before, but it's what then happens when it gets to the budget time and what the details are. That's the crucial thing. I don't personally know what those details are.
Okay, next is for Kelly. What advice do you have for areas in California with limited access to MAT services?
I think it goes back to partnership and innovation, finding out what other communities are doing. There's so many innovative approaches to this problem in rural areas. We've got a burgeoning telehealth industry where you can get addiction counseling and buprenorphine prescribing through your cell phone. There's an investment that CHCF is making in an innovative business model called Groups that is setting up really low-cost group counseling and medication management, and specifically targeting at rural areas. And again, we've seen almost like this pop-up integration, in buprenorphine emergency departments and primary care and public health clinics. And that's where I really think these local coalitions can be helpful, because it's one thing to say at the state level and look at a map and map out the treatment deserts and look at the white areas, which Marlise and I have been doing. And it's another thing to be in that community and trying to figure out where are people going, what has hit this community? Are we dealing mostly with fentanyl? Are we dealing mostly with pain pills? And then getting local leaders capacitated to solve that problem. So again, like I said, I'm really excited about applying for VISTA volunteers, because my dream is to put a VISTA volunteer full-time in each of these communities where their entire goal is to work with community leaders and solve that problem with others.
Bravo.
That's awesome. I was a former VISTA volunteer. That's fantastic. I'm employed now, but I think that's an awesome idea. This question is for Sam. And so you talked about the impact of fentanyl. And in California, we haven't had a huge, we've had pockets of it, but what advice or warnings can you give us in seeing this in other states?
It is one scary thing. I was in Dayton, Ohio last week. Dayton is on track, did 1,900, with the coroner's office, I was hanging out with them, and they did 1,900 autopsies. Now they have Dayton, the way the state is organized, they handle autopsies for 30 counties along the Ohio River and southwest Ohio. And they did 1,900 autopsies last year, and they're on track to do 2,800. Maybe a little bit less than that, 27.6 or something like that. 2/3 of all their autopsies are drug related, and almost all of those are opiate. It is a scary thing. You want to get an eye-opening view of this. I had one recently where I'm not a tech idiot, but I had a guy show me the dark web. That is one scary place. It's people offering fentanyl. Who knows where they are? They're in Hungary, they're in Nebraska. You have no idea. There are these big websites that are similar to eBay or Amazon. You pay in Bitcoin, but you can find fentanyl, a few grams of fentanyl for $50, $100. I saw a kilo of fentanyl on sale for $12,500. That would kill like everybody, I don't know, in the Inland Empire or something. It's mind-boggling. And what that does is, before, law enforcement kind of had a handle on the heroin trade out of Mexico, because there was only one area where it could come from, and that was the Pacific Northwest that Nayarit is a part of, but also Sinaloa, Durango, Michoacan, Guerrero, Chihuahua. Those states right in there and in the mountains was really the only, you didn't have a climate to grow the poppy too well, but above all, that was the only place where you had people who actually knew how to harvest it. They've not figured out a way of mechanizing opium production. You still have to do it the same way it's been done for centuries. And so if you don't have control of that area, you can't produce heroin in Mexico, of course. And now, of course, you can produce this. This fentanyl is an opioid without any, no plant involved, no harvest, no seasonal requirements or anything like that. And so you can produce it in, my understanding is it's not terribly difficult. Clearly, what you also find are all these fentanyl analogs coming out, which are a way, I think in the underworld there's a concept that if they change the molecular structure, all of a sudden that drug is no longer illegal. Now, a lot of states, Ohio's being one, I believe the federal government being another, has added language so that if a drug is like or similar or something like that, then it's covered under the statute. But nevertheless, you have all these new, very bizarre, the one that I encountered that killed a kid, what I was, a case I'm kind of writing about in Dayton, was a thing called cyclopropyl fentanyl. Why? Because the guy who was helping me had spotted it on the web, got the coroner's office to develop a blood test for it. They began to test and they found out 9 people have died from cyclopropyl fentanyl. Who invented it? Where are they selling it from? How did it get here? By the mail, I guess. It's like this deep, murky area that we have no idea. I would say California has been lucky, but I would say that I know of a case in Santa Clarita just a month ago, I think it was, where 9 guys pooled their money, went and bought heroin that I thought was heroin, and all 9 of them overdosed. I believe 2 died. The other thing that's happening is that fentanyl has become something that people on the street are asking for. The same way when a heroin would kill somebody, everyone would go, "Oh, I want that heroin," because they're looking for that chasing that high. That's also happened, as well as this is largely a white epidemic, but in Dayton, African American community does not get involved in it. They do use cocaine, so they've been lacing cocaine with fentanyl, and I don't know why exactly, except for that it's a high and it's very, very cheap. It may also be a way of creating new addicts so that you'll have customers. But fentanyl is a scary damn thing, and all the analogs, and of course carfentanil, which is a separate drug. I'm waiting for a time when that is used in a kind of a terrorist event, throwing a bunch of carfentanil in a subway car or something like that. Everyone would die within minutes. The other issue is, of course, fentanyl requires far more Narcan to revive somebody. And in small rural counties particularly, budget is a huge issue. One Narcan hit, from what I understand, is about $60. Everybody needing 6-8 hits of Narcan before they can revive. And it also sends people into overdose much quicker. Heroin is a kind of a gradual thing over 2-3 hours. Fentanyl is more like seconds or minutes. It's a scary, scary new permutation on this whole problem.
Great. I'm just going to give you both an opportunity for any closing thoughts, and we'll start with Kelly.
Well, I have to admit, listening to Sam, I get discouraged, but then I remember that we tried the war on drugs and the fight against supply side only in the 1980s, and we failed. And I have to believe that everyone in this room who's on the demand side is doing the hard work of getting people into recovery. People don't die of fentanyl if they're in recovery and sober. They're much less likely to die of fentanyl if they're on buprenorphine. People don't start using fentanyl if they never start using opioids. So I just have to believe that the way out, and again, as Sam said, there's not going to be one solution, but we won't stop the deaths until we continue to go all out on treatment and prevention and buying time until we can figure out how to decrease the supply. But we will fail if all we focus on is the supply. So again, I thank you for your service, and I'm so inspired to see all of you here in this room doing this good work.
I guess I would just like to say something that dovetails with what I said in my talk, and that is that you all may have felt that you work kind of alone. There's nobody, no natural allies. I do believe now that on this topic, parents are out there wanting to talk, wanting to be part of the fight. It's really important to enlist them, to find them, and not just parents, family members, because this affects people of a wide age range. I think they're out there. It was like the AIDS epidemic, and when people wanted to lie and fabricate and hide and just dissimulate. I don't think that's the case as much anymore. I still think there's some of that, but you would, I think you would do well. They would be helped if family members would be helped if they felt they were part of working together with people who had been, in the trenches for quite a long time, like I know a lot of you have been. And so I think I would look for those folks. I would encourage them. I would find one and have that person recruit others. I'm from the media, and I could tell you that when a parent tells the story, nobody can tell the story better and with more poignancy and more impact than a parent or a family member. It just doesn't happen. So you would be very, very well advised. Again, this idea of using community, it means using lots of different groups that had never maybe been thought of. PTAs, clergy, Kiwanis, all these folks, football coaches, athletic trainers, all these folks can be now allies in this. And I think you need to look for them and recruit them and have them be part of your team, because I think you've been working in a fair amount of isolation for too long.
Great. Can we give just another round of applause for Sam and Kelly? And so it closes day 2. I just have one more announcement. And so conference participants with the prevention strain of SUD innovation syndrome, you're invited to a meeting at 5 o'clock in the boardroom, so it's out the door here over to the left. And so what this group wants to do together is to share your vision for prevention efforts and what you need to make it happen. So come learn from each other. So that opportunity is today at 5 o'clock over in the boardroom. So thank you so much, and we'll reconvene tomorrow morning.